Well, hello. Thank you so much for such a warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to chat with us. I can only hear you on this side. I don't know if that's on your end or on our
Oh,
platform's end.
geez.
I just wanted to let them know.
Let me, it's my, keep talking. I'll see if I can fix it.
Sure, no problem. If there's one thing I can do, it's fill some dead air. So, for those of you who are joining us on the Pine platform, excellent. Thank you for doing so. There is a chat feature along with the live stage, so feel free to chat with us. I've gotten some requests to speak French a little later, so if you're all very well behaved, I will speak French on air for everyone's benefit. In the meantime, also feel free to ask questions as we go along. I'll try to get to them. But primarily, the questions that we're going to be taking a look at were actually collected ahead of time by the DevOps Days Kiev organizers on Slido, however you'd like to pronounce that. So I'm going to be mining that for some questions as we go. But ideally, we're just going to let this conversation flow wherever it ends up flowing. How do you feel about that, Joe?
That sounds great. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. It's still only on the one side, though.
Oh, geez. Okay. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, that is, all right. I'll keep working on it, but let's continue on and we'll make it work.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. I'll just, it works just fine. So, Joe, before we begin, before we dive right in, I first said, I had to try to sum up, right? Like, who is Joe during the introduction for anybody out there who doesn't know him? But if you were to give your own introduction off the top of your head, what would it be?
Well, I mean, I've been in the computer industry for, oh gosh, going on like 25 years or something like that or longer. In my entire career, I've worked on developer platforms. And so I think my career and sort of what I would sum up, is around how do we make developers more successful, give them the tools that they need. And I think, I've done that across, like I started my career working on Internet Explorer back at Microsoft. When I first joined Google, I worked on Google Talk, and we viewed that as a chat platform, and based on protocols like XMPP, and laid a lot of the groundwork for like things like WebRTC and stuff like that. And then got involved in cloud, and that's been the last, gosh, I don't know, like 8 years, 8 or 10 years of my career has been doing cloud stuff. And so, yeah, I really like building platforms. And for me, the definition of a successful platform is something where a creator of that platform, is surprised and delighted by what people do with it. And so, like, I'm always impressed when people do things with things like Kubernetes that I didn't even imagine, right? It's not something that we thought about, but it's sort of taken on a life of its own.
Taking on a life of its own is, I think I would call it an understatement. It's taken on a planet of its own, a galaxy of its own. Everywhere you look, there it is, right? And I like what you mentioned about about platforms, about people, about doing things, building things, right? And that actually is my slightly designed segue into the first question, the most upvoted question that's on Slido so far, which actually relates to doing and building. There are a lot of choices out there. Raw manifests, Helm, customize. I
Ah,
mean, zillions of tools, zillions of possibilities. How can an engineer even make a decision about how to jump in and start managing their infrastructure?
well, I think that's the stuff that you mentioned is specifically around sort of wrangling YAML, and I think that's YAML itself and the configuration of Kubernetes is an interesting thing that sort of fell out of the way that we designed the system and the way that the ecosystem evolved. I actually gave a talk at Software Circus last October for Halloween, called "I'm Sorry About the YAML," where I go into some detail about sort of how we got to where we're at there. But I think there's this larger issue around, you look at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation has this landscape slide and a site to be able to track all the different sort of projects that are sort of in this orbit. And it's both impressive and intimidating, right? It's impressive because there's so much there, and it's a real sign of this sort of, beautiful chaos that we have around so many innovative projects. But then from a user's point of view, there's this like, where do I even start? There's just so many choices here. And so I think, a couple of things that I would say is that, the first thing is get started, right? Perfect is the enemy of good. Pick a tool set, get to know it, learn about the system. I think sometimes folks do this on their own, doing a little bit of research. Other times they'll partner with a vendor, and I think this is the type of thing that we do with VMware and Tanzu to actually help to be able to provide, like, here's a set of things that'll get you started. And at least you'll find some success. And then if you want to change things up, if you want to learn, if you want to color outside the lines, you can do that as you build up some knowledge, some expertise in terms of the systems that we're talking about here. So I think, but the biggest thing is just, go ahead and get started, and, don't let yourself get slowed down with that sort of analysis paralysis of having too many choices.
Right, sort of the tyranny of choice, the tyranny of possibility, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the type of thing of like, which programming language should I use? And it's like, well, it depends on the problem, depends on your experience, depends on and there's no right answer, right? And I think a lot of the technologies in this space, there's pros and cons, there's strengths and weaknesses, and they've all evolved for their reasons. And so, understanding that is a full-time job, but then also a programming language is better than no programming language, right? So just get started.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Dive in, figure out where the pain points are, architect around them, and then move your project forward, basically.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So there are quite a number of questions coming to Slido now. Thank you, everybody in the chat. If you want to ask a question, we have put the Slido URL into the chat feature, so please do check that out. I see some more questions coming in, so thank you for that. No spoilers, but there are a lot of questions coming up about, well, what's coming up? People looking for you to play Oracle and try to determine what's in the future. We'll keep those for a little bit later. So we'll start in the present and the here and now, at least. So one question here, and I think this is a theme that I've seen at other DevOps Days conferences, is about being an engineer, not so much about the technology, but about the discipline and the practice of working in engineering. What makes one a good engineer? What makes one an excellent engineer? And what can one do to move oneself forward in one's career? Look at me avoiding the use of pronouns.
Well, this is a fascinating thing, and the industry has changed dramatically since I started. My first internship at Microsoft was in '95, right? So we're the industry has changed dramatically here, and I think some of the things that have worked for me in the past don't necessarily apply anymore. And so I think anytime you ask anybody a question like this, I think it's important to recognize that we all have our point of view, and we're sort of an N of one. And so take any advice or thoughts that I have here with a grain of salt. But for me, I think it's important to recognize that being effective changes as you progress across your career. Early in your career, effective means practicing your craft and knowing the technology and being good at it. As you get more senior, the job kind of changes out from under you, and you move from directly doing things to empowering others and working through other people. And so you move from sort of like thinking about what you directly control to what you can influence, and how do you actually wield that influence in the most effective way. And so anytime, especially at a big company, you're talking about the most senior engineers, you'll hear words like, what is your scope of influence? And I think that this is really about, are you effective in setting the direction? And so I don't think that 10x engineers exist, not in the sense that most people think of them as. I think that there's this idea of there are people who can produce a lot of code. But there's this old saying that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so I think that there's for me, a real 10x engineer are the folks that make everybody around them, say, 25% more effective. And if you can do that across a large team, you are creating a multiplier that I think can be a lot greater than 10x. And so I think that there's what it takes to be a great engineer in terms of your craft. And then I think there's what it takes to be a great engineer in the context of being effective in a business setting. And a lot of times that ends up blending the roles outside of engineering into leadership, communication, product management. All of these things really start to come together in a lot of ways.
So I like the word you use there as a multiplier, right? This is a term I first encountered at Mozilla years ago. We
Oh, were
talked
you at
about,
Mozilla? And I was at IE back in the day. Was this like, were
yeah,
we?
yeah, this is the, yeah,
There
both
was
showing
always
our
a
age a
lot of
little bit
stuff
here.
going on there. That was fascinating. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
cakes and barbs
interplay.
getting exchanged.
All right, so I suspect beers and tall tales in 2022, but
Yeah, exactly.
for for the here and now, this idea of acting as a force multiplier, right? Where you can go, look, I have gotten to the point where my individual contribution is effectively maxed out, right? I have produced all the lines of code that I can produce. I have deployed all the infrastructure I can deploy, right? And then it's how can I, help to move other people forward, right?
Mhm.
And that's wonderful to speak about, I guess, in lofty terms, which is how we're speaking about it now. But if you're actually, a senior or a staff level engineer for whatever that title might mean at your organization, because these are not equal titles everywhere, and you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, yeah, I want to become a false multiplier. I don't feel like I am now. What would be some techniques, things to look for, stuff to start to analyze to find those opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I have a blog post. I wrote a document internally here at VMware about sort of effective tech leadership from my point of view, and I've been meaning to turn that into a public-facing blog post or document. And my co-founder at Heptio wrote a companion one called Effective Product Management that you can find out there. Craig McLucky has it. So if there's any product managers in the audience, you can do a Google search for that and find it. I think it's important to recognize that leadership is different than management. And I think this is the first thing that you have to click, you have to come to a realization from. And I think for a lot of organizations, for a lot of people, they think the only way they can be leaders is to be managers. And it turns out that management is a different job from leadership. And like, I don't know about you, but like I've managed people in the past. And if any of them in the audience watching, I'm sorry. I am at best a mediocre manager. And I think part of my career progression was recognizing that my passion's not in management. If you get to the end of the day and like, as a manager and you spend all day doing one-on-ones and coaching people and you think to yourself, hey, like, I didn't do any real work today, you're not a manager, because that is your work as a manager. That is your real work, is to actually do those support functions. And, there's a lot that goes beyond that too. So for me, it's recognizing that leadership is not management. And I think it's possible that, you can lead from any position in the organization. And so find something that you have some knowledge and some passion about, find a hole in your organization and create sort of horizontal communities around the types of things that you're passionate about. So if there's a technology that you're using and you're an expert, become a resource, not just within your group, but across a larger and larger domain. All of a sudden, you're a leader in your company around that technology. If it's something like testing and you're passionate around test-driven development, start to be able to talk and evangelize about that. And now all of a sudden, you're having impact, not just in your team, but across the larger organization. And then people see that skill of being able to communicate, being able to lead, being able to have that impact across the organizational boundaries. Those are the types of things that start to signal somebody's like really, being a tech lead at a larger scope. Another aspect here is don't be bound by job titles and don't be bound by sort of like, hey, this is your job, you need to do this. Some of the best folks that I know, if there's a bug, they'll chase it no matter where it takes them, right? If it's a broken switch that's flipping bits with a certain bit pattern, they'll debug that. If it's understanding sort of how the compiler works. I mean, I think back when I was at Microsoft early in my career, and I'm going to date myself here. This was when the Pentium FDiv bug came about, and I don't know if you all
bug.
remember this. Yeah, so there's a bug in the Pentium processor where under certain patterns the floating point division would return erroneous results, which is like, that's bad, serious bad news. And we actually saw it and actually helped diagnose that from the IE team, because we had crash reports coming in one of the image decoders that was actually only showed up on a certain type of processor. And so we were able to help narrow that down because we had this go. That's chasing down a bug no matter where it leads you. It's like nobody expects a processor bug to actually do this. But that's the type of thing where, don't let yourself be bound by artificial boundaries. If you are curious, if you are a polyglot in terms of being able to take on any technology, that'll make you that much more effective and lead to more opportunities for you to be a leader.
Excellent, thank you. And for those of you out there who think that processor bugs aren't a problem anymore, oh my.
No, it's only getting worse,
We're-
right? Especially
it's only
security
getting
stuff with
worse.
things like, side channel attacks and all. It's all crazy, crazy.
Exactly. All right. So it's a smorgasbord of questions here. So I'm trying to create a narrative and failing. So I'm just going to start throwing some at you, if that's okay.
Sure, sure.
All right, cool. So actually, here's one that I'm frankly also interested in. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it. In FOSDEM 2019, Chris Nova mentioned that Kubernetes was apparently originally developed in Java. One, is that true? And two, why switch to Go?
Yeah, no, this was true. So Brennan Burns did some of the first prototypes of Kubernetes before it was called Kubernetes. So our original, so the system inside of Google was called Borg, and we wanted a friendlier Borg, and so we called the system. This is deep Star Trek geekyism, but like we called the original Project 7 after 7 of 9, right? This idea of it's a friendlier, more human face on Borg, and and this was about the time when Docker was just coming out, and we were looking at Docker, we were looking at containers, we had GCE up and running, and we're like, hey, we can put this stuff together and start creating Borg-like automation in a way that is a heck of a lot easier than sort of building things up from the ground that like Borg was. And so some of the original prototypes were the language that Brendan was most comfortable with. Again, get started is the thing, right? And that was Java. Now, as we went to open source this and look at development, I think a big part of what we were looking at is what makes an effective open source community, what creates a lot of contributors. And we were blown away with the level of interaction that Docker specifically had. And I think, my push at the time was like, Go is a big part of that, because Java with, the build tools was very intimidating to be able to get started with. I was looking at Mesos at the time, huge C++ code base, right? Package management in C++ doesn't really exist, right? So there were all of these things that, we looked at Go and we're like, this is the sweet spot where it feels like a systems language at the time. But it's also much more readable and usable. And so the ethos around Go of being, simple by design so that you have more readable code really, I think, played out for Kubernetes. Now, that being said, I think we've suffered in some places because of Go. The lack of generics and the fact that Kubernetes does a whole bunch of types means that we do a lot of things like code generation where maybe generics would have helped us out there. I think, if we had to do it over again, would we have looked at Rust? I think maybe. I mean, Rust is a heck of a lot more mature now than it was back then. And there's definitely a lot of folks looking to do interesting things down at the node level with Rust. So I think it just made a lot of sense at the time from the point of view of community and actually really making this accessible for people to get involved with.
So I like that you touched on their accessibility right at the end, and I think that's a pretty important part about it. And to bring that back to the first part of our discussion, which is where we're like, you got to pick something, right? So picking the thing that like, okay, we understand some of the trade-offs we're making here. We certainly don't understand all of them because we can't know, but we understand some of them. Would you consider, Go today to be an accessible language? And did you consider Go at the time to be an accessible language? And what would be your reasoning there?
I mean, so from our point of view, we wanted, something that was fast, that was type and memory safe, and I think and felt like a systems language. So a lot of fine-grained interactions with underlying system primitives. And Go is great for writing server-side software, like and doing sort of a lot of the processing. I mean, that's the bread and butter of what Google does, and I think it definitely shows with Go. I think now it's less accessible. I think Kubernetes has grown to the point where getting started with the Kubernetes code base is definitely intimidating in a way that we didn't want it to become. But I think maybe that's just sort of, as the project has gotten more mature, that tends to happen. I think the module situation in Go has complexified things a little bit. But I don't think anybody has solved dependency management in a great way. So yeah, I would say I think Go is still pretty darn accessible.
Yeah, and then I would agree with that. And package management aside, it's a sticky, thorny issue in every environment where there are packages, right? So it's not like that's a Go specific issue. If you were thinking about rewriting Kubernetes, this is where I'm going to leave it. But if you were thinking about rewriting Kubernetes today, right? Or starting from scratch on Kubernetes today, would you choose Go again, or perhaps something more esoteric, or perhaps
I mean, I don't know. I
something?
think Go is still mature. I think, like, especially with generics coming, I think Go would be a good place to start. Like I said, I think the only other contender that I think in my mind would be Rust. And again, type safety is a critical piece of the puzzle here. What I do worry about is Rust gets a little bit too meta, and so you can't look you like there's some gotchas in Go, but you can open up a Go file and pretty much like understand what's going on with it. I don't think that that necessarily applies with Rust. There's definitely a steeper learning curve with Rust. I'm not a Rust expert, so maybe I'm wrong here. What I would change, though, is the way that we architected Kubernetes is I don't think at the beginning we understood the power of Kubernetes itself being a platform for building automation and building on top of. With the advent of things like operators or custom controllers and custom resource definitions, the success and the power of those things, I think, honestly took a lot of us by surprise. And so if we were going to build it all over again, I think what we would probably do is have some cleaner architectural boundaries around the core API mechanics and sort of create those things in the abstract without any containerization sort of like knowledge about those things, and then separate and really have a strict line between sort of API substrate and this would be etcd and the API server versus the extensions, and bring all the Kubernetes-ness, all the containerness in the extensions on a relatively generic core. And I think that there's some efforts underway upstream to be able to do this, but it's generally low priority and moving slowly. But I think everybody who's worked with Kubernetes would say, yeah, that's something that we probably should have done from the start if we had known. But you never know where these things are going to take you.
Well, that's just it, right? It's an open source project. It got traction, and all of a sudden, it's out of your hands, right? It's I saw a quote on Twitter that said, "Any successful open source project," I'm paraphrasing, "any successful open source project is like Goodwill Hunting in reverse," right? You start off, as a professor with a blackboard full of charts, and you end up as a janitor getting into fights with people. So the project sort of takes on a life of its own.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think there's, that whole extension mechanism is both from an architectural point of view, but also becomes an organizing principle for Kubernetes as a project. And I think that this is an interesting thing that I've seen in my career, is that architecture and organizational boundaries go hand in hand. I mean, it's like there's a Conway's Law thing going on there someplace. But I think that, one of our goals with Kubernetes as a project was not to actually set up gatekeeping so that every new feature had to go through some sort of Kubernetes council to get into the project, but instead really allow people to do their own thing. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely that sort of janitorial aspect to Kubernetes, but I think because the ecosystem is more than just the Kubernetes core, there's a ton of opportunity for folks to be able to sort of start their own little worlds that they'll end up being janitors for.
It's janitors all the way down. But that idea of
Exactly.
extensibility is critical, right? And it's definitely one of the things that made Kubernetes, into what it is today, right? It's the ability that we can build things on top of it, and that we're not, constrained too severely by opinion. And that actually leads to a series of questions that we've got on the slide, and I'm going to summarize a couple of them a bit together to the best of my ability. So around containerization, for example, there was a time not so long ago when Kubernetes and Docker were uttered in the same sentence, and they were locked together, right? But now, of course, Kubernetes has gone into different directions. Docker has undergone the journey that it's undergone in recent times, and there are some other container technologies that are out there. For your money, or at least for your hobby, what kind of containerization technology is hot and interesting to you now? And does it make sense within the context of Kubernetes today?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a lot of history around this, and I think whenever we talk about Docker, we have to talk about sort of which Docker. Is it Docker the company, Docker the project, Docker the image format, right? And I think there's definitely, as we start teasing those things apart, there's bits and pieces of that are still absolutely instrumental to the Kubernetes project and larger ecosystem. And I think we all owe a huge debt to the work that the Docker folks did. There's always a lot of drama when you have these hyper competitive experiences, but there's a lot of amazing ideas that came out of that chaos there. In terms of looking forward here, there's I think there's two ways to look at this, is that can we evolve the contract of what a container is so that we can start taking on different types of technology? And so you'll see, integrated container runtimes in various clouds. Like there's Fargate on Amazon, there's ACI instances on Azure. Google has their own thing that's built around sort of nodeless types of way of running things. They also did a huge investment in gvisor, which is a strange sort of super hypervisory type of thing. And then in VMware, we have these things called vSphere native pods, right, where you're starting to blur the lines between VMs and containers. And that container contract continues to work, and we're starting to, we're continuing to use the same container images, but being able to run those things in different ways under certain different circumstances. Another evolution that we're seeing is that the standards around container images, a set of layers with metadata around it, via the Open Container Initiative, that's evolving in terms of being a generic artifact store that can be used for storing all sorts of things beyond just container images. That's another sort of spin-off of this world that's, I think, going to be impactful and very interesting. I think going down the stack, we're seeing, like, could we use the same mechanism, but think about, like, hey, could we have a container where instead of actually running a Linux binary or a Windows binary, you're running WebAssembly. And in doing so, you end up with a much more constrained, but also much more lightweight and portable runtime for this. And so there's a question of, like, can we reapply some of the Kubernetes control mechanisms on a type of container that is very different from what we think about as container today in terms of a Docker container? And what are the, the bits and pieces of Kubernetes that we can reuse as we go down that journey? Now, moving the other direction, I think we look at things like, serverless machine learning, data processing, and we're starting to see people, again, this is, Kubernetes being a platform for building platforms. We're starting to see folks build experiences on top of Kubernetes that end up being, more focused for those different things. And so the container at that point then starts to fade to the background, right? You can build a serverless system on top of Kubernetes or a function as a service thing, whether using Knative or OpenFaaS or what have you. And these technologies, like, there can still be a container there, but users don't necessarily think in terms of containers as they're doing it. We're doing a lot of work inside of VMware as part of the Pivotal acquisition to take the sort of the platform as a service Cloud Foundry use case, which is essentially, I have some code, make it run, I don't want to worry about it. Being able to run that on top of Kubernetes in an integrated way, where you're doing this fine-grained extensibility and interoperability with the rest of Kubernetes. So you can get that experience, but we're not cutting you off from that larger ecosystem that is both, awesome and intimidating. And so that ability to build more specialized experiences on top of Kubernetes is, I think, another place where we're starting to see, the idea of a container or the idea of a runtime or the developer experience continue to evolve.
There was an enormous amount of information contained in the last 5 minutes. I've been trying to
Sorry, I'm going all over the place here.
No, it's incredible. I mean, there's so much to think about there. I don't even know where to take the conversation next. WebAssembly, right?
Yeah.
As a former Mozillian, anytime WASM gets mentioned, my ears perk up. What's happening in that space? Let's go down that rabbit hole a little bit. I'm very, very interested to learn more about that particular thread.
Well, I think, WebAssembly, it's fascinating to see these things start in the browser, and just through, like, sheer, force of adoption, we find them in other places. Like the whole, Node.js would not exist except for the browser ecosystem. And I think the same thing is for WebAssembly. It started off with, like, how do we create a generic, more fundamental runtime inside the browser? And all of a sudden it's like, well, a lightweight runtime, that's super generic, that's a useful component outside of just the browser. And I think we're starting to see that happen with WebAssembly. I think one trend that we're seeing in the industry here is, you rewind the clock 5 or 6 years ago, and you saw everything, cloud was the thing. And, people that were predicting the future then were saying, like, hey, we're going to have 3 major clouds. There's going to be these enormous data centers. And it turns out that there's been a set of sort of counter forces that have pulled it away from centralized clouds. Now, some of this is more regional clouds around data sovereignty, GDPR, all the things that are really causing folks to want to keep, computation local for both practical and human concerns and legal concerns. I think we're also seeing the rise of sort of low latency computing. Some of this is driven by edge. And so the question is that, you have a small site, you want to do a lot of custom workloads and custom sort of stuff for customers. You need a runtime that is fast, lightweight, scales to zero. WebAssembly starts looking like at least a piece of the puzzle as you're building that type of stuff up. And so I think, we're seeing a merging between CDNs and clouds as these things start to actually meet in the middle around edge. And I think you'll see that folks like Cloudflare are taking WebAssembly, turning that into their workers product, right? That's, I think, an early indication of the different types of runtimes that we're going to be seeing. And I think there's a question in terms of where does Kubernetes have a role to play here in a way that boosts this without necessarily trying to apply that same rigid model across these new domains. Oh, my camera just decided to zoom in on me here. This is what happens when you have too fancy of a setup here. Yeah. There we go.
Maybe get a very close, make sure they get the dentistry is all on point there. It's very nice.
I know, right? This is my way of dealing with quarantine as I buy more and more AV equipment, and then you got to futz with it.
Certainly not the only one. So I like that you mentioned, Cloudflare there, for example, right? So if those of you watching today haven't checked out Cloudflare Workers before, do definitely check that out. It's actually kind of a neat bit of kit, but it's not new, right? The idea of Workers as a service Cloudflare has provided has been around for quite some time. It's a relatively established thing now. Insofar as technology goes, anything that's more than 6 months old is relatively well established. But the idea of pushing compute out to the edges, that's just one implementation. Right now, it's a big, noticeable, publicly accessible one, but it's just one. Is this something that a private organization running their own cloud, and I put this in quotes, is that something they could be taking advantage of as well, or is that something that's really only important at scale, like on the web?
I don't know, to be honest. I think that's a really good question. I think one of the things is that the security posture of these different technologies is vastly different. And I think that the ability to secure something like WebAssembly, and again, this is why it's a good fit for the browser, is leaps and bounds around the ability to secure other types of technologies. And so I think, VMs are another, case of this. I think, maybe the JVM with enough sandboxing is something that you can feel confident about. But if you're setting up a service where you truly are dealing with hostile actors on your platform, people that are going to try and take you down, your threat model becomes different, and you actually evaluate technologies differently. And I think that's a place where WebAssembly actually, starts to shine in ways that other technologies may not. And so that's a concern that you have when you actually, really do have antagonistic users on your platform. For most enterprises working internally, they don't need that level of hardening. It's more along the lines of like, if somebody's doing something bad, well, you call them up and tell them to stop. And if they don't, you fire them, right? Like, this is the way we deal with things inside of a company. That's not the way that you deal with it when you're dealing with external parties and platforms like that. And so I think, that's one difference there. And then I think the density that folks are looking to get, generally, the density in terms of number of applications on a piece of hardware, number of applications and customers per operator that's helping to manage that. I think you definitely see that be orders of magnitude different when you're dealing with sort of internal private clouds versus building public products. And so I think, it's a really good question. I'm not quite sure, for those internal facing things, how critical, some of these super lightweight and super isolatable systems become.
That's excellent point that you touched on, which is, the idea of the threat model, right? Is understanding why are we going through the hoops to deploy this thing because some other company we really admire is doing it, or is it actually something that we need? And this is, not to troll, I really mean this sincerely, but this is one of the big discussions around Kubernetes in general, right? Do we really need Kubernetes? Should we be jumping through all of these hoops, perceived or otherwise? I'm not looking for you to justify or make excuses.
I'm happy to talk about
what
that.
I am curious about is is what is the what's the thinking there? Like as someone going, okay, we're deploying a new thing, we've got software, we've got a business we're trying to build. Why choose Kubernetes?
So I think a couple of things to keep in mind here. So number one is that, like, I'll be the first to say Kubernetes is not the answer to every problem. And so there are plenty of folks who can be very successful without Kubernetes in the mix. The second thing I think is worth talking about is, you know, are you approaching Kubernetes from the point of view of somebody who's running Kubernetes so that other people can use it? Or are you approaching Kubernetes in terms of somebody else is running it and you want to use it? And I think whether you're coming at this from as a platform provider or as an application team changes your view of Kubernetes pretty dramatically. If you have a Kubernetes cluster that somebody else is actually helping to run and they're presenting that higher level abstraction, that's actually a great place to be. And the overhead of being able to run something on Kubernetes is compared to learning AWS, right? It's like, I think, a lot of folks are familiar with AWS, so they forget the pain of actually, decoding the alphabet soup that is AWS these days. But if you imagine a new user coming to the world being like, do I figure out AWS or do I figure out Kubernetes? I mean, they're both pretty darn complicated, from that sort of new user point of view. And there's a lot of, to be said for some of the portability of both systems and skills that comes with Kubernetes over the more fractured cloud landscape that we're viewing now. So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that I talk to a lot of enterprise customers, and I think that you'll see that the different needs in terms of infrastructure change dramatically, whether you are a startup or whether you're a relatively large company thinking about it. And your idea of like, what is your scaling factor is a big part of it also. So what we find is that with smaller companies, especially tech-focused startups, your scaling is in terms of amount of data, number of nodes, that type of thing. And your concern is like, are we going to be in business 3 months from now? Not like, hey, what happens, if, there's a geopolitical shift and I actually can't use this cloud provider anymore. Right. And so, whereas I think as you start getting bigger, as more mature as a company, again, your risk trade-offs start to change there. Your scaling factor doesn't necessarily mean number of nodes in some ways. It may mean number of teams, number of applications, number of constraints, number of locations. And so you're scaling across diversity in terms of scaling across like sort of, just sheer size. And having a consistent tool set across all of the diversity of the platforms that you have to manage as a large enterprise is something that I think a lot of folks really, really value. And then again, that portability of skills. If you are an enterprise and you have a footprint in all these different places, because that's the world that a lot of enterprises live in, as you train up a developer, as you build standard systems around CI/CD, as you build ways to create a secure supply chain so that you can trust the stuff that you're building and deploying, having a consistent substrate across all those different environments, incredibly attractive. And then from the user's point of view, they're like, hey, I have an internal platform. This internal platform, has some opinions for my company, but also the skills that I'm building here are transferable outside of this company to other places. That's also really, really great from an application team's point of view. So I think these things, are, like any engineer, like the answer to these things has to be, it depends, right? I think there's a reason why a lot of folks gravitate towards systems like Kubernetes, but it's clearly not one size fits all.
The oftentimes unsatisfying answer of "it depends"
Yeah, exactly.
is an alarmingly common answer in the world of technology, certainly once you get past a certain scale. So I can appreciate that, and that's fair. I plug Datadog, but at Datadog we use a lot of Kubernetes, and have contributed fairly significantly to the code base. And we have these brown bags internally where we have these discussions, and even on my team to have relations, like we're inventing stories around this stuff. We keep coming back to this question of, okay, like how do we justify the tool use? How do we tell people what should and shouldn't do, where the best practices are? And every single time the answer is it depends. So if you're out there watching this, live or on YouTube afterwards, and you're thinking to yourself, boy, I wish I had more concrete answers. Well, welcome to the world of senior and staff level engineering. It depends.
Exactly.
That's all there is to it. Yeah. All right. So switching gears a little bit. An excellent question that's actually just gotten shot up the chart since I last looked. One of my favorite questions to ask in interviews. What are 3 books you recommend to read? They don't have to be limited to technology.
Oh, wow. I'm so bad at this. I don't have I mean I don't have a great attention span, and so I generally go for like cliff notes types of things versus going deep into various books. Let me think. What have I been reading lately? I read a lot of science fiction, and some of it is escapism, but some of it is exploring sort of different ways to actually relate and think about things. And so, the latest series that I've been, let me check my app here.
Go check the Goodreads.
Oh, yeah. The latest series that that I read is Children of Roon, which is this science fiction about a sort of post-human world with like different, like how would people interact if, if they were spiders or if they were. It's really fascinating. I'm kind of embarrassed, but I also love it. Right? It's great to sort of
Well, sort of
explore
this
that
idea
type
of
of stuff.
exploring kind of what comes next, these ideas of transhumanism, these ideas of, you know, as you said, post-human futurism is an interesting way, I think, to allow us to start thinking outside of ourselves. And if the vehicle happens to be, what if a spider was talking to a person that was also a building, then so be it. But it's also a way for us to exercise those bigger picture thinking skills while still keeping it light and fun, right? I'm
Exactly,
also just
exactly.
trying to
All right. So
justify
other
your
stuff
science
that I've
fiction reading.
been so yeah, so I'm just looking through the stuff that I've read recently that I enjoyed. Susan Fowler's book Whistleblower, talking about sort of like her journey through Uber, and sort of like, for me gave a real insight. It's like I'm a white dude in tech, right? It's like I have a very different experience than a lot of other folks. And so I think reading about that, really understanding that is fascinating. And I think that I really enjoyed her writing in that book. Was really good. In the same vein, Ijomo Alu wrote this book called "So You Want to Talk About Race," which is essentially a primer for race conversations for white people. I thought she did a great job framing that. Also, she's also local to Seattle, so it's great to see that. Um, yeah, so let's see. I think, and I also love, history, and both podcast and he did a book and an audio book on it. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. He did a book called The End Is Always Near, and this it's kind of over the top, and it's and it focuses on drama, so a lot of talking about like history of wars and conflict and that type of thing. But I always find that there's different insights in terms of the way humans relate, how big things turn into little things and sort of snowball, and the human side of a lot of these things. And I think this is one of those things, again, talking about senior engineers, I can relate this to war, is that like it's clear when you listen to these histories that the experience of folks on the ground in the trenches, literally, right, because that's where the phrase comes from, is very different from folks that are behind the lines, right? And so there's always these reminders of again, another sort of military sort of saying is that the map is not the territory. And so when you're a leader, when you have these wide views, you have to keep in mind that you probably have a distorted view of what's going on. And it's really important to recognize that you have to go down, understand what's really happening, talk to folks on the front lines, and reconcile that with your map of the world, because your map may not represent reality.
I mean, if the quote, I think was Alfred Korbitsky, a Polish last name. I'm butchering that, I'm sure. Who was generally credited with saying that the first time, and the thesis there was that a map, by definition, cannot accurately reflect reality,
It's
right?
always a
So if you're relying
simplification.
on
It's always an abstraction. Yeah.
Precisely. So anytime you're looking at a map of anything, anytime you're looking at a description of anything, what you're looking at is an interpretation and by definition, an incomplete or flawed version, thereof. And I guess being aware of that is pretty critical, to tie into a lot of the themes that we've been talking about here today about, what is your journey towards, being a staff engineer look like, or if you want to go into people management, or how do you choose technology, right? How do you make technology decisions that are going to affect your business? Is you understand that the thing that you're looking at is a representation, and that it is by definition an incomplete representation of something. That's a little tidbit, I think that's clutch
Yeah.
for people
There's
to
a little bit
understand.
of like Plato's allegory of the cave in there also, right? Where it's like what we see is just a shadow of reality. It's not reality, right? And I think that applies, metaphorically across organizations also.
I feel like we could have like a whole nother hour just on that. So why don't we'll prevent the falling down that particular rabbit hole for today. But again, aforementioned beers in 2022. So some questions then about the future, because we've been talking about science fiction. We've been talking about some of this stuff. So I'll put you on the spot. Not that I haven't been this whole time already, but have you play Oracle a little bit? There's so many here. Oh, here we are. So Kubernetes, that's a thing. It's mainstream now. And you're over at VMware now. What is coming next for you at VMware, for VMware and Kubernetes in 2021, 2022? What can you talk about?
Um, so I think, I'll, part of doing a startup is you get to know a lot of VCs. And, this whole idea of what's coming next is the type of thing that oftentimes VCs will ask. And so, I'll sometimes have conversations where folks will say, hey, what's the next thing that we're going to see in this world? What is the up and coming trend? Or which company and, Kubernetes company should I invest in? And I think the important thing is that we're moving past sort of like, who's building a business, what's coming with Kubernetes. That's not as interesting anymore. What's interesting is what are the new things that folks can do with a technology like Kubernetes that they weren't able to do before? And I think that's where things start to get interesting. What are the things that Kubernetes and cloud native in general unlocks that was very, very difficult before? And I think, for me, it comes down to, this adaptability to different situations. Cloud is wonderful. Cloud is great. I helped get GCP up and going with, GCE early in the day. But but cloud is one point in a very large search space, and I think there's other interesting points in that space. And I think Kubernetes is not going to be able to meet all of those things, but it definitely has wider applicability than sort of off-the-shelf hyperscaler cloud. And so for me, I think another example would be, we look at Linux as a technology, right? It's kind of boring now. It does what it does, but it runs on everything from a cell phone and watches all the way up to mainframes. And so that adaptability of that technology is only enabled by, relatively generic systems that can be applied in a bunch of different places. And that often goes, or almost always goes, hand in hand with open source. And so for me, I think the interesting things is not, like, hey, Kubernetes as a replacement for hyperscaler cloud. Right? It's like there's a lot to be said for like using a cloud if you're on a cloud. Now, Kubernetes has a way to start providing a basis for a meta cloud that provides a cloud-like experience across a whole bunch of different infrastructure. That starts to get more interesting to me. Kubernetes as a way to, deal with, here in Seattle, we have the Amazon stores that you go into and you look up and it's all cameras and machine learning and, talking to folks, there's as much, equipment in the back as there is in the front in terms of being able to actually process this. Now, clearly, that's all built on Amazon hardware stack, things like Outpost, I'm sure. But there's going to be other folks who are going to be looking to build those solutions. And, and the set of technologies that they can get from a cloud provider may not apply there. But Kubernetes running as a way to manage a whole bunch of stuff in the back of a sort of automated store, that's not crazy, right? That starts to make sense. And that's the type of niches that I think Kubernetes and the larger ecosystem can go into in ways that we don't see today. I think, and I'll talk to all sorts of companies that have leaned into Kubernetes relatively early, and they've just continued to build and build and build on top of this stuff. And like, I'm thinking of one retailer that has global control planes, multi-center apps, like, a single point where they're actually controlling a ton of clusters across a ton of stores and warehouses and stuff like that. It's amazing, right? And I think that's the type of thing where you're not going to get that with a sort of single vendor cloud solution. And that's what gets me excited about continuing to invest in Kubernetes.
Fair enough. I really like some of the themes that you were exploring there, this idea of the industrialization. I don't mean that in the way that we oftentimes mean it when we say about hardening something, but I mean it literally in the idea of making something so repetitive, so banal, so easily, built and repeated that it can sort of just be inserted anywhere kind of for any purpose, right?
Yeah.
And another really interesting theme there, which was, heterogeneous environments, right? If you're working with one particular language and you develop for clients that only use one particular vendor, then probably that particular vendor's cloud offering is a natural choice for you, right? But as you said, if you're a storefront and you've got video cameras and you've got a thing for monitoring the heat in the ovens, who knows what you've got going on, right? Some of it's going to be running Linux, probably. Some of it's going to be running other things, probably, right? Some sort of weird embedded nonsense. If there was a way to orchestrate, that's a loaded term. If there was a way to sort of deal with all of that, as you said, on a substrate, that could be very compelling. And if it happens to be Linux, we can rub a little eBPF on there, keep it interesting. So I like that as the idea of Kubernetes as sort of a catch-all substrate. That's actually very, very powerful.
Well, I mean, one of the things we like to talk about upstream in the community is people are like, what's the future for Kubernetes? I'm like, we want to make Kubernetes boring, right? Good infrastructure is boring. It fades to the background. You don't think about it. It's well understood. It's predictable. That's our goal for Kubernetes, right? It's not exciting, right? It's by definition, right? And so, but in terms of what actually has longevity, that's the type of thing that we think has longevity in the Linux is never going to go away, or at least not in our lifetimes, right? It's always going to be around somewhere, in some way, shape, and form. And that's, and that I think is a great example as a template in terms of what does success look like for infrastructure in this world.
Well, Linux is certainly not going to go away since it's been launched into space a couple of times now. And unless those things get hurled into the sun, I guess, Linux is going to be around for a little while there.
Yeah, I don't know if Kubernetes has made its way into space yet. I know that, there was talk of using it on some of the NASA moon missions. I don't think it was used, at least on the recent Mars mission. But I think, it's a matter of time.
I rather like the idea of some sort of like interplanetary pod, right? Where latency on an order that normally we never have to deal with.
There is a whole IETF effort around the interplanetary networks and sort of, what are the special considerations when you end up with super high latency like that. I don't think Kubernetes is built for latencies quite that high. It's very hard to maintain consensus, Paxos or Raft consensus across those types of distances.
Well, normally latency is the thing we're fighting against, not, dealing with on large scales. Although, I guess if we want to talk packet loss and retransmission, we could always roll ourselves back up into Erlang. Kubernetes rewrite in Erlang, anyone?
Oh, yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah.
I don't know if that's the future, but if it is, if you're developing that right now, hit me up on Twitter. I'd be happy to hear about it.
Well, there is a bug in Kubernetes to rewrite it all in Bash, so we could do that also.
You know what? The stuff I've seen rewritten in Bash over the years would shock and amaze. Maybe not you, but would shock and amaze most. So you do a lot of terrible things with Bash. Yet you can't have a solid array. So, figure that one out. Last couple of questions, super fast lightning round before we wrap it up. When choosing a new language to learn, which one would you choose between Python or Go?
I would say Go, but that's just me. I think both are great.
Fair enough. How would you summarize what is Kubernetes in one sentence?
Kubernetes takes a bunch of servers and a bunch of things you want to run on those servers and make sure that the right things are running in the right places at the right time.
Excellent. Velaro is quite a popular tool. What other Heptio VMware tools do you recommend people to check out?
Contour, I think, is another great tool. This is an ingress controller built on top of Envoy, and it is working hand in hand with upstream in terms of rethinking some of the ingress service APIs. So a lot of really interesting stuff there. It works well with namespaces and has a really interesting CRD model. We have a new project. This isn't a Heptio one, but coming out of Tanzu called Pinniped, which is essentially an auth adapter so that you can use consistent auth across a ton of different Kubernetes environments. So that's really interesting. And then talking about YAML wrangling, again, this is a VMware thing. Actually came from Pivotal. We have this tool set called Carvel, which is really taking that Unix philosophy of small tools that do small things and applying that to managing YAML. And so there's a templating engine, but you can swap it out. There's a way to apply, but you can swap it out. There's a GitOps type of continuous thing, but you can swap it out. So all these things are separated, and we want that to be an expanding tool set over time.
Excellent. Thank you. I look forward to the bash rewrite of all that. That's it for us here today. Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with me, to get the questions from our audience, to really to share from your experience openly and candidly. I really can't thank you enough for taking the time out. Is there anything that you'd like to get out there, ways to get a hold of you, or if maybe you got a book coming up? I don't know. Last thoughts.
Well, feel free to follow me on Twitter. It's a mix of technology and personal stuff. So, just be aware. And then one question is like, was there any questions about my last name in there?
Not a one.
No? Okay. Because like my understanding, and I don't speak Russian, I don't speak Slavic languages, but my understanding is Beda means like, essentially great sorrow and sadness. And so, take that for what it will be. And I'm always curious when I work with folks that are coming from those countries, like people are laughing at me under their breath because it's kind of like Dr. Death.
Great sorrow and sadness and Kubernetes. All right. So on that bombshell,
there you go. You put it all together.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe, again for taking the time out to speak with us. That's all the time we have for you today. Thank you so much. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cheers.